In the early years of his reign, Charles VI of France was known as Charles the Beloved. Ascending to the throne in 1380 at just 11 years old, his early rule was guided by a regency council dominated by his uncles, the Dukes of Anjou, Berry, Burgundy, and Bourbon. France, still exhausted from the ongoing Hundred Years' War, and the recent peasant uprisings, needed a stabilizing monarch. Initially, it seemed that Charles might provide just that. When he reached his majority in 1388 and took personal control of the government, he made a widely praised decision. He dismissed his avaricious uncles and recalled his father's former advisors known as the Marmousets, who implemented financial and administrative reforms. But behind the facade of royal confidence, a darker reality would soon emerge. The first signs of Charles's mental instability were not immediately understood, nor were they publicly acknowledged. In the summer of 1392, while preparing a military expedition to Brittany to punish an assassin of one of his advisors, the king experienced a sudden and violent psychotic break. During the journey in the intense heat, Charles reportedly heard a loud noise and abruptly drew his sword, killing several members of his own escort. He could not be calmed. When finally restrained, Charles collapsed into a catatonic state. This episode marked the beginning of a lifelong pattern. His condition was alarming. Charles would sometimes forget his own name, fail to recognize his wife Queen Isabeau of Bavaria, and on several occasions believe he was made of glass, an irrational fear known as the glass delusion. During these episodes, Charles would demand that special measures be taken to prevent him from shattering. The royal court, stunned and unsure how to proceed, concealed these events as best they could. The king's advisors attempted to continue governing, but with each relapse, the question of how to manage the kingdom during his absences grew more urgent. Charles's illness did not follow a simple, predictable trajectory. He would sometimes recover for weeks or even months, appearing fully lucid and participating in council meetings. Yet these reprieves were never permanent. The inconsistency added further stress to the political structure of the monarchy. Without a clear protocol for royal incapacitation, power drifted to those who could most effectively assert themselves around the king, chiefly his ambitious relatives. Among these, Louis I, Duke of Orleans, Charles's younger brother, emerged as a key figure. He positioned himself as both a protector of the crown and a steward of the realm. His closeness to Queen Isabeau raised suspicions and political tensions. Others, notably Philip the Bold, Duke of Burgundy, viewed Louis's growing influence with alarm. Thus began the rivalry that would soon evolve into one of France's most damaging internal conflicts. The king's deteriorating mental health occurred at a time when the kingdom could least afford it. France had entered a fragile truce with England, but tensions persisted. Domestically, the legitimacy of the monarchy was foundational to the feudal system. Without a stable king, the entire hierarchy risked fragmentation. French law provided no firm precedent for handling the mental collapse of a reigning monarch. Unlike in England, where the concept of a regency had historical grounding, the French court resisted acknowledging the king's incapacity. To do so would undermine the divine right and sacred character of the monarch. Therefore, Charles's madness was an open secret whispered at court, speculated upon by foreign ambassadors but never formally admitted. It was managed through improvisation. A council of princes led at different times by the Dukes of Orleans and Burgundy rotated in and out of favor as they competed to control the royal seal and the appointment of officials. The queen, increasingly marginalized by the men around her, attempted to assert authority but was frequently bypassed or scapegoated. In the midst of this turmoil, the broader population of France remained largely in the dark. Chronicles of the time note rumors of sorcery, divine punishment, or demonic possession. Charles's illness coincided with a general sense of disorder, economic downturn, war fatigue, and a church in schism. The papacy had split between Rome and Avignon, and France, aligned with the Avignon claimant, found itself entangled in religious as well as political confusion. For many, the king's madness seemed emblematic of a cursed and fractured age. Efforts were made to cure Charles, though they reveal more about medieval medical theory than any real understanding of mental health. Physicians prescribed purgatives, leeches, and prayers. Pilgrimages were arranged. At one point, the king was taken to the shrine of Saint Denis in hopes of miraculous healing. None of these interventions proved effective. Over time, the court grew accustomed to cycles of recovery and relapse, reacting less with alarm and more with resignation. Still, the implications of Charles's madness could not be ignored. Royal decisions made in lucid periods were often reversed during his episodes. Nobles took advantage of his condition to pursue their own agendas, frequently in contradiction with one another. The power vacuum at the heart of the monarchy created fertile ground for factionalism and vendetta. From a modern perspective, some historians speculate that Charles may have suffered from schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, or even porphyria, a hereditary disease that can manifest with neurological symptoms. But medieval France had no such vocabulary. What mattered then was not the diagnosis but the consequence, a monarch unable to reliably govern in a system wholly dependent on personal rule. The first decade of Charles VI's illness did not bring total collapse, but it did usher in a period of escalating instability. Every time he faltered, power shifted slightly out of royal hands and into the grasp of those who claimed to act on his behalf. The question no longer centered on how to heal the king, but how to rule in his stead, and who had the legitimate right to do so. On the night of January 28, 1393, the French royal court gathered at the Hôtel Saint-Paul in Paris to celebrate the remarriage of a lady-in-waiting to Queen Isabeau. The occasion was meant to be lighthearted, a moment of respite from the growing anxiety around King Charles II's mental health. At the center of the festivities was a masquerade, one of many such entertainments the Valois court had adopted from Italian and Burgundian influences. This particular event, however, would mark one of the most infamous tragedies of Charles's reign, the Bal des Ardents, or Ball of the Burning Men. The concept was theatrical. 6 young nobles, including the king himself, disguised themselves as wild men, a common folkloric figure in medieval Europe, by donning costumes made of linen soaked in pitch and covered with flax to simulate hair. They were chained together and intended to leap and dance wildly for the amusement of the guest. In theory, it was a harmless spectacle. In practice, it was a catastrophe waiting to happen. As the wild men performed, Charles's brother Louis, Duke of Orléans, entered the hall late drunk and carrying a torch. Accounts vary as to whether he approached out of curiosity or recklessness, but what followed was clear: the torch was brought too close to one of the dancers. The pitch-soaked costumes ignited instantly. Flames engulfed the performers. Panic overtook the room. 4 of the dancers were burned alive, dying in agony before the horrified court. Only 2 survived, one by diving into a vat of wine, the other Charles VI, shielded by a quick-thinking noblewoman who covered him with her skirts. The event sent shockwaves through France. While many understood it as a tragic accident, others saw it as evidence of divine displeasure, or more dangerously, confirmation of the king's instability and the recklessness of those around him. The symbolism was difficult to ignore: a monarch dressed as a wild man, nearly consumed by fire, while his brother's careless torch brought destruction. Whether or not it was his fault, Louis of Orléans came under intense criticism, and Charles's position as king grew increasingly untenable in the public imagination. In the days following the ball, Queen Isabeau and several counselors urged Charles to distance himself from public festivities and refrain from participating in such dangerous spectacles. The king agreed, at least nominally, but the damage had already been done. The Bal des Ardents cemented the sense that France was being governed by a man either too mentally fragile or too poorly advised to maintain royal dignity. Moreover, the political ramifications began to intensify. The incident further exposed the growing rift between the Duke of Orléans and the Duke of Burgundy. Philip the Bold, already skeptical of Louis's influence at court, capitalized on the disaster to position himself as a more reliable steward of the monarchy. He used his resources and popularity in the north to criticize the excesses of the Parisian court and promote a vision of more disciplined, pragmatic governance. For the common people, the fire became a parable. Chroniclers described it with a blend of horror and moralism, emphasizing the dangers of luxury pride and unchecked behavior. In some corners, it was believed that the devil himself had inspired the costumes and the fire. Others interpreted the tragedy as a punishment for the court's decadence during a time of war, famine, and spiritual uncertainty. Within the royal family, tensions mounted. Queen Isabeau, frequently the target of gossip and political attack, found herself in an increasingly precarious position. Her influence over the king was resented by both the Orleanist and Burgundian factions. Rumors swirled about her alleged relationship with Louis of Orléans, whether romantic or merely political. These rumors, unfounded though they may have been, served to further polarize the court. Charles's own condition did not improve. If anything, the trauma of the fire may have deepened his psychological decline. In the months that followed, his episodes of disorientation and paranoia grew more frequent. He sometimes claimed to be St. George, at other times he denied being king at all. During lucid intervals, he expressed guilt over the deaths of the men at the masquerade, though he retained little detailed memory of the event itself. Administrative governance continued by default rather than design. The monarchy still functioned, but key decisions were increasingly driven by factional interest rather than coherent royal policy. The council, now regularly split between Orleanist and Burgundian sympathizers, struggled to agree on military priorities, financial strategies, and foreign diplomacy. In particular, Charles's illness and the court's internal dramas limited France's ability to respond effectively to the ever-shifting posture of England under Richard II and later Henry IV. Meanwhile, in Paris and the surrounding regions, public confidence in the monarchy waned. The concept of the sacred king, whose body was both political and divine, depended heavily on the perception of personal competence and moral rectitude. Charles's fragility, physical, mental, and symbolic, eroded that perception. Whispered doubts turned into open questions. Could a mad king truly channel God's will? Could a kingdom fractured by internal rivalry survive the storms ahead? Despite these growing doubts, Charles remained officially in power. No legal mechanism existed to remove him without disrupting the entire constitutional order of the realm. And so France continued forward, led by a monarch who alternated between periods of partial clarity and complete detachment. Each relapse cast a longer shadow. Each temporary recovery raised false hopes. By the mid-1390s, it was clear to all that the king would not recover. The only question left was who would rule in his place and under what justification. The Battle des Ardennes, then, was more than just a tragic accident. It became a metaphor for a monarchy on the edge, flamboyant, distracted, and dangerously combustible. It revealed the costs, both human and institutional, of a political system that had no contingency for royal collapse. And it set the tone for a court that would increasingly define itself not by Charles's leadership, but by the power struggles unfolding in his absence. In the aftermath of the Battle des Ardennes, the French monarchy entered a phase of political paralysis that would come to define Charles VI's reign. As the king's mental condition deteriorated, power did not transfer cleanly to a designated regent. Instead, it fragmented. Two primary factions emerged at court, one centered around Louis the Frere, Duke of Orleans, the king's younger brother, and the other around Philip the Bold, Duke of Burgundy, Charles's uncle. Both men claimed to act in the king's interest, yet both were fundamentally driven by personal ambition. The regency issue remained unresolved, largely because no one dared challenge the theological basis of royal sovereignty. In France, the king ruled by divine right, and to declare him mentally unfit risked undermining the entire premise of monarchical authority. So while Charles was often incapable of making decisions or even recognizing his own officials, he was never formally deposed or replaced. Instead, the realm operated under an informal, unstable system in which rival relatives competed to be the power behind the throne. Philip the Bold, whose wealth and influence derived in large part from his control over the wealthy Duchy of Burgundy and its Flemish cities, sought a centralized and commercially stable France. He advocated conservative fiscal policies and drew strength from alliances in the north. By contrast, Louis of Orleans favored increased taxation to fund military action, especially against England, and had a strong base in Paris. Their political visions clashed, but so too did their personalities and methods. Where Philip projected caution and pragmatism, Louis exuded flamboyance and courtly charisma. At the heart of this rivalry stood a king increasingly removed from public life. During his episodes, Charles would retreat into long silences, refuse to bathe, or wander the palace in confusion. When lucid, he often had to be reminded of current affairs or reintroduced to key officials. The burden of governance fell more and more heavily on the queen and on the dueling factions vying for control of royal policy. As the 1390s gave way to the early 1400s, the factionalism worsened. Philip the Bold died in 1404 and was succeeded by his son, John the Fearless. John, unlike his father, was aggressive and uncompromising. He viewed Louis of Orleans not merely as a political opponent, but as a threat to Burgundy's future in France. He also inherited a complex network of Burgundian alliances, particularly in urban centers such as Bruges and Ghent, which gave him the resources to wage political and eventually military warfare within the kingdom. Meanwhile, Louis of Orleans continued to amass power through royal patronage. He was granted additional lands, monopolized access to Queen Isabeau, and was rumored to influence the king's decisions even during Charles's lucid intervals. In 1407, tensions reached a breaking point. On November 23rd, while returning from a visit to the Queen's residence, Louis was ambushed in a Parisian street and brutally murdered by assassins. The killers were soon linked directly to John the Fearless. This assassination marked a turning point. Rather than denying his involvement, John justified the murder as a tyrannicide. He commissioned clerics and lawyers to produce pamphlets and treatises arguing that Louis had been a danger to the realm, a corrupt manipulator exploiting the king's illness for personal gain. The justification found support among segments of the population weary of royal excess and high taxes. Nevertheless, the act shocked the court. Never before had a prince of the blood been openly assassinated by a rival noble within the capital. The fallout was immediate and severe. The royal family split into two bitterly opposed camps. The supporters of the late Duke of Orléans, known as the Armagnacs, after Bernard VII. Count of Armagnac, who married Louis's daughter, demanded justice and retribution. The Burgundians, meanwhile, sought to solidify their grip on Paris and align themselves with populist causes to justify their actions. Thus began a full-scale civil conflict that would engulf France for the next 3 decades. Charles VI remained largely unaware of the political chaos spiraling around him. Isolated by his condition and increasingly marginalized by competing factions, the king played no active role in adjudicating the crisis. Even during his rare lucid periods, his influence was minimal. Power now lay with whichever faction controlled the court and could present documents bearing the king's seal. The regency, which might have served as a stabilizing institution, never took formal shape. The queen attempted to assert herself, but her authority was frequently contested or ignored. The royal council became a site of constant upheaval, with ministers and officials dismissed or replaced depending on which faction held temporary ascendancy. In some years, France effectively had 2 governments, one Armagnac, one Burgundian, each claiming to speak for the same king. The broader consequences for France were disastrous. The factional strife drained financial resources, delayed military responses, and weakened the monarchy's ability to maintain order in the provinces. Towns and cities were forced to declare allegiance to one faction or the other, sometimes under duress. Urban rebellions became more frequent. The Estates General, already weakened by royal inertia, became a largely irrelevant body, unable to mediate between the warring camps. All of this occurred while England, under the newly crowned Henry IV, watched carefully. The fragmentation of French authority presented opportunities that would soon be exploited. But within France itself, the dominant impression was one of paralysis and decay. The king was still alive, still technically reigning, but in practice he was a prisoner of circumstance, his signature affixed to policies. He barely understood his presence, a hollow symbol for a monarchy in freefall. In hindsight, the power struggles of this period were not merely political contests, they were structural symptoms of a system unable to adapt. France in the early 15th century was still governed according to feudal hierarchies and dynastic principles, yet it lacked the institutional mechanisms to manage a long-term royal incapacity. The result was improvisation violence and gradual institutional collapse. As the 3rd decade of Charles's reign closed, France was a kingdom without a functioning center. The king lived in a twilight state, drifting between moments of clarity and complete confusion. Around him, princes vied for influence not through parliamentary debate or administrative reform, but through assassination propaganda and open war. By the 2nd decade of the 15th century, the political fault lines in France had deepened into civil war. The assassination of Louis of Orléans in 1407 had transformed factional rivalry into a prolonged and violent struggle between the Armagnacs and the Burgundians. Each side laid claim to legitimacy, each professed to act in the king's name, and neither possessed a consistent advantage. The monarchy, long weakened by Charles VI's mental collapse, now served merely as a battleground for more decisive forces. The Armagnacs, led by Bernard VII of Armagnac, and later by Charles of Orléans, Louis's son, consolidated power around the royal court. They enjoyed strong support from Queen Isabeau at various times, especially when her interests aligned with those of her late husband's faction. They also held influence in the southern provinces, where loyalty to the crown remained relatively stronger. The Burgundians under John the Fearless retained control over key northern cities, especially Paris, and cultivated support from a rising urban middle class disillusioned with the corruption and excesses of court aristocracy. Both factions waged not only military campaigns but also propaganda wars. Pamphlets, public sermons, and symbolic acts such as parading relics or staging pageants were employed to claim moral superiority. Religious justifications were common. Armagnac supporters portrayed themselves as defenders of legitimate royal succession and justice, while Burgundians accused their rivals of tyranny and wastefulness. Amid this ideological chaos, the average French subject found daily life increasingly disrupted. Taxes rose, local disputes went unresolved, and mercenary bands roamed the countryside, pillaging with little fear of reprisal. All the while, King Charles VI remained the absent center of power. By 1410, his condition was chronic and largely irreversible. He would pass weeks in silence, forget his own children's names, and occasionally flee in terror from his own reflection. Reports from courtiers describe long periods in which he would sit motionless, refusing food or speech. Yet his name was continually invoked by both camps and documents bearing. His seal were still issued, though the actual decisions behind them were made by whichever faction temporarily controlled the royal household. Queen Isabeau attempted at various times to play a moderating role, seeking to negotiate peace between the warring camps. But her own reputation had suffered. Seen by both sides as unreliable and subject to persistent rumors about her personal conduct and political alliances, she struggled to maintain a stable base of support. Her attempts at brokering reconciliation often ended in failure or betrayal, further destabilizing the monarchy. The stakes rose dramatically in 1413, when the Burgundians briefly seized control of Paris in a coup supported by the Cabochons, a radical urban faction that called for moral reform and purges of court corruption. John the Fearless returned to the capital in triumph and implemented a series of harsh reforms targeting Armagnac officials and royal advisors. Executions followed. The streets of Paris ran with blood as ordinary citizens turned on their neighbors under the banner of anti-corruption. However, the Burgundian hold on Paris did not last. The radicalism of the Cabochons alienated many Parisians, and within a year the Armagnacs had regained control. The cycle of reprisal continued. Neither faction could maintain dominance for long, and both left destruction in their wake. The city of Paris, once the heart of royal authority, was now a battlefield in miniature, its governance alternating violently depending on which faction held the gates. Amidst this backdrop, the English monarchy saw an opportunity. In 1415, Henry V of England launched a renewed campaign in France, claiming his ancestral rights as King of France under the old Edwardian claim. The French response was hampered by internal division. While the Armagnacs controlled the nominal crown, their forces were scattered and their coordination poor. The Burgundians, more focused on their own political position, did little to support the national defense. The result was the Battle of Agincourt, a disastrous defeat for the French. On October 25, 1415, Henry the Fierce's outnumbered army routed a much larger French force, killing thousands of knights and capturing many high-ranking nobles. Among the dead were key members of the French aristocracy, including Charles d'Albret, the Constable of France, who had commanded the Armagnac forces. The battle devastated morale and confirmed the deep dysfunction of the French political structure. Charles VI, informed of the defeat, reportedly failed to comprehend its significance. Whether due to madness or deliberate concealment by his advisors, he took no active role in shaping France's response. In the absence of a coherent royal policy, Henry V pressed his advantage. Normandy, long a strategic prize in the 100 Years' War, was invaded and systematically conquered over the next few years. In the wake of Agincourt, the internal French conflict only worsened. Rather than uniting to face the English threat, the Armagnac and Burgundian factions blamed one another for the disaster. The Armagnacs accused the Burgundians of treasonous inactivity, while the Burgundians insisted that Armagnac incompetence had caused the defeat. The civil war escalated, with both sides now fighting not just for control of France, but for its very survival. Even the idea of a French nation fragile at the best of times in a feudal society began to fray. Local lords declared their own allegiances, cities switched sides under pressure or inducement, and the once sacred figure of the king became increasingly irrelevant. Charles VI remained in Paris but was rarely seen by the public. He spent most of his time in isolation, attended by a shrinking circle of servants, physicians, and clerics. By 1418, the Burgundians had once again taken control of Paris, this time more ruthlessly. The Armagnac leaders in the capital were rounded up and executed. Bernard VII of Armagnac was butchered in the street. The king still living within the city was spared, but only because he was seen as politically inert. John the Fearless now exercised de facto rule in the capital, treating Charles as a figurehead. Yet this power was short-lived. In 1419, John the Fearless was himself assassinated during a parley with the Dauphin Charles VI's son on a bridge near Montereau. The murder, carried out by Dauphiniste partisans, destroyed any hope of reconciliation between the factions. Burgundy aligned itself openly with the English. France's internal war was now entangled with its external one, and the king's incapacity had become the cornerstone of national disintegration. The assassination of John the Fearless in 1419 marked a decisive rupture in French politics, one that turned an already fractured realm into an open field of betrayal and realignment. His son Philip the Good, newly elevated as Duke of Burgundy, was not only younger and more calculating than his father, but also far more inclined to exact vengeance. Within a year of his father's death, he forged an alliance with the English, altering the strategic balance of the 100 Years' War. This alliance culminated in the Treaty of Troyes, signed in May 1420. It was an unprecedented document, one that effectively disinherited the Dauphin, Charles the son of Charles VI and Isabeau, in favor of the English King Henry V. The treaty stipulated that after Charles II's death, the crown of France would pass not to his son, but to Henry V and his heirs. To solidify the agreement, Henry married Charles's daughter, Catherine of Valois. From the perspective of the treaty's authors, namely Queen Isabeau the Burgundians and the English crown, this arrangement promised peace through dynastic union. In practice, it guaranteed further war. The treaty relied on two assumptions: that Charles VI would live long enough for the English to secure their claims, and that the French population would accept the English king as their future sovereign. Both assumptions were deeply flawed. Charles, by now nearly 3 decades into his illness, was physically feeble and mentally absent. He had no role in negotiating the treaty and likely never understood its content. His seal was affixed by proxies. The treaty was signed in his name, but not with his consent in any meaningful sense. For the French public and much of the nobility, the idea of excluding the Dauphin from succession was not only unorthodox, it was outrageous. France had a well-established tradition of direct male inheritance, particularly under the Salic law, which excluded women from transmitting royal rights. The Treaty of Troyes violated that tradition. More importantly, it symbolized the depth of France's internal collapse. The crown, compromised by mental illness and factionalism, was being offered to a foreign power. The Dauphin, refusing to accept the terms of Troyes, established a rival court in the Loire Valley. From this southern stronghold, he declared himself the rightful heir and began organizing resistance to both the English and the Burgundians. Though his resources were meager and his legitimacy questioned in parts of the country, he maintained control over much of central and southern France. To those loyal to the traditional monarchy, he represented the last viable thread of continuity. Meanwhile, Henry V, now styled as the heir apparent to the French crown, launched further campaigns to consolidate English control. Normandy was already firmly in English hands, and by 1421 much of northern France was under English or Burgundian administration. Paris, still nominally governed in Charles II's name, was in reality a puppet state directed by Anglo-Burgundian forces. The French monarchy had become bifurcated: a king, in name only, in the capital, and a prince claiming kingship in the provinces. Throughout this period, Charles VI remained alive, if not entirely present. His physical health declined. He suffered from malnutrition, periodic fevers, and the long-term effects of stress and neglect. Witnesses described him as hollow-eyed, withdrawn, and increasingly unrecognizable, even to those who had once served him closely. Yet the machinery of monarchy continued to move around him. Royal decrees continued to be issued in his name. His image appeared on coins. His presence was cited in court ceremonies, religious processions, and diplomatic correspondence. In political terms, he was a ghost that could still sign documents. The English, for their part, were deeply invested in maintaining this illusion of continuity. Henry V recognized that his claim to the French throne rested entirely on the framework established by the Treaty of Troyes, which in turn depended on Charles VI's supposed will. The longer the French king lived, the more time Henry had to enforce his position and eliminate the rival claim of the Dauphin. Accordingly, Charles was kept under close supervision, more hostage than monarch. In the south, the Dauphin faced his own set of difficulties. While he remained the focus of French loyalist efforts, his control was tenuous. He lacked the resources of Paris, the administrative apparatus of the crown, and the financial networks of northern France. His court was peripatetic and underfunded. Many nobles hesitated to commit to his cause, uncertain whether he could truly restore national unity. His reputation had been tainted by the assassination of John the Fearless, which many blamed on his inner circle if not on the Dauphin himself. Yet despite these setbacks, the Dauphin's position slowly stabilized. In part, this was due to the sheer unpopularity of the English alliance. French towns that had accepted English rule under duress began to chafe under occupation. Taxes increased. Foreign garrisons imposed strict discipline. Religious and cultural tensions simmered beneath the surface. Resistance movements took root, often supported by loyalist clergy or exiled officials. The image of Charles VI, once symbolic of dysfunction, now became a rallying point for legitimacy. Even in madness, the king represented a native dynasty, something the English, despite their claims, could not replicate. Meanwhile, Queen Isabeau remained in Paris politically isolated. Her role in endorsing the Treaty of Troyes had alienated both factions. Once a central figure in court intrigue, she now lived a marginal existence. Her efforts to maintain royal dignity had failed. Her children were divided. Her husband was incapacitated. And her adopted son-in-law, Henry V, was preparing to assume the crown she had once tried to preserve for her own bloodline. In 1422, the political situation reached a sudden and ironic climax. On August 31st, Henry V died unexpectedly of dysentery at the age of 35, just weeks before Charles VI would also die. Henry's infant son, Henry VI of England, inherited both the English and French crowns, in name but not in substance. The Treaty of Troyes had placed enormous power in the hands of a child, and his regents, just as the Dauphin began to consolidate support in the south. For Charles VI, the years following the Treaty of Troyes were not marked by a final return to power or lucidity. They were characterized by slow disintegration of his body, his influence, and the institutions that had once sustained him. The court around him shrank. His rooms grew quieter. In his final months, even the illusions of ceremonial kingship began to fade. He had long ceased to rule. Soon he would cease to live. Charles VI died on October 23rd, 1422, at the Hôtel Saint-Paul in Paris. He had reigned for 42 years, more than half of them, plagued by recurring bouts of insanity, factional conflict, and a foreign invasion. His passing, long anticipated and in many ways inevitable, triggered no widespread mourning. Rather, it deepened an already dire succession crisis and exposed the sheer fragility of the French monarchy at a time when continuity mattered most. Despite the provisions of the Treaty of Troyes, which designated Henry V and his heirs as successors, the king's death did not settle the question of who would rule France. Instead, it created two rival monarchies. In Paris and other English-occupied territories, proclamations were issued declaring the infant Henry VI of England as the rightful king of France. The young king's regents acting from London immediately began the process of governing in his name through a council overseen by the Duke of Bedford, Henry the Higher's brother. In the south, the Dauphin Charles, disinherited by the treaty but supported by loyalist nobles, clerics, and cities, also declared himself king. He did so not in Paris, but in Bourges, where he had taken refuge years earlier. His coronation would not come until 1429 in Reims, but by assuming the title Charles VII, he asserted continuity with the Valois line and directly challenged the legality of the English claim. This dual monarchy produced a map of France effectively split in two. English and Burgundian forces controlled most of the north, including Paris, Normandy, and parts of Picardy. The Armagnac-aligned Dauphinists held the central and southern regions, including the Loire Valley and the Midi. The French crown, long the symbol of unified royal authority, had become a contested emblem wielded by opposing factions. The death of Charles VI did not unify France. It crystallized its division. The condition of the monarchy at the time of Charles's death was not only legally ambiguous, it was institutionally broken. For decades, real power had been exercised not by the king, but by military leaders, factional princes, and foreign regents. Charles's signature had authorized decisions he barely understood. His presence had justified regimes that acted independently of his will. His death stripped away the last fig leaf of legitimacy for the Anglo-Burgundian regime and forced it to rule under the name of a child foreigner. The French populace, already exhausted by war and taxation, faced an uncertain future. Loyalties were fluid. Some towns switched sides based on local leadership, economic necessity, or military pressure. Others attempted neutrality only to be drawn into the conflict regardless. Rebellion and occupation became routine. The church too was divided. Bishops were pressured to support whichever regime dominated their diocese. In many areas, royal justice ceased to function altogether. Local feuds flared, often with no recourse for mediation. Charles VI had lived long enough to see his kingdom reduced to a battlefield of rival princes and foreign invaders. He had witnessed the fragmentation of the court, the betrayal of the traditional succession, and the humiliation of his dynasty. But it is unclear whether he ever fully understood the scope of what had happened. In his final years, he was confined largely to his chambers, tended by a shrinking retinue of physicians and attendants. Some chroniclers describe him babbling incoherently, others note stretches of near total silence. Occasionally, he was said to weep without explanation. The Hotel Saint-Paul, once a vibrant royal residence, had become more a place of confinement than governance. Visitors were rare, ceremonial functions were minimal. The court existed in name, but not in form. Those who remained in service to Charles often did so out of obligation rather than conviction. His daughter Catherine of Valois had already left France to join Henry V in England. His wife, Queen Isabeau, was politically sidelined and publicly reviled by both factions. His son, the Dauphin, had not seen him in years and was now preparing to claim a throne effectively in opposition to his father's final wishes. The king's burial was arranged with appropriate dignity, but lacked the grandeur of earlier royal funerals. He was interred at Saint-Denis, the traditional resting place of French monarchs, yet his death passed with little national commemoration. The ceremonies were constrained by the political uncertainty of the moment. No national council met to mark the transition. No consensus formed around a new monarch. The Valois line had not ended, but its authority had fractured beyond immediate repair. Ironically, Charles VI's long reign, so often characterized by absence and disorder, allowed time for both the rise of English power and the gestation of a French resistance. Had he died earlier, the Treaty of Troyes might have taken firmer root, and Henry V might have lived to impose it with his own strength. Instead, both kings died within months of each other, leaving a power vacuum in both kingdoms. The war would continue no longer simply as a dynastic dispute, but as a broader conflict over sovereignty, identity, and national survival. For the French monarchy, Charles's death closed a tragic chapter. His reign, begun with hope and reform, had descended into madness, civil war, and foreign domination. Yet in the very collapse of his authority lay the seeds of renewal. The Dauphin's claim would not be extinguished. The English regime, overextended and increasingly resented, would face growing resistance. And in time, a new figure, one entirely absent from Charles's court, would emerge to change the course of the war, Joan of Arc. But in 1422, that moment had not yet come. France remained divided, battered, and uncertain. The king was dead. His body lay beneath the stones of Saint-Denis. Above the realm he had once ruled teetered between conquest and collapse. With the death of Charles VI, France entered a perilous interregnum, not because the throne lacked claimants, but because it had too many. On one side was the infant Henry VI of England, born to Catherine of Valois and the late Henry the Husky, proclaimed King of France by the Treaty of Troyes. On the other was the Dauphin, Charles' self-declared Charles VII, asserting a direct hereditary right in defiance of the treaty. Neither man won a child, the other, a claimant without a coronation, could immediately fill the vacuum left by a monarch whose reign had long ceased to provide real leadership. The English, flush with confidence after years of military success, moved quickly to enforce Henry VI's claim. Under the regency of John of Lancaster, Duke of Bedford, the Anglo-Burgundian alliance was reinforced and expanded. Paris, Rouen, and much of northern France fell in line not because of popular support, but due to military control and administrative continuity. Royal charters, taxes, and bureaucratic structures continued to operate in the name of the young Henry as if nothing had changed. But beneath the surface loyalty to an absent infant king and to a foreign regency was fragile at best. In the south, Charles VII's government was far less stable but far more legitimate in the eyes of those still loyal to the Valois line. His court in Bourges was impoverished and plagued by factional disputes, but it held symbolic power. For many, Charles represented not just hereditary continuity, but the rejection of foreign dominance. Yet Charles himself was a deeply ambiguous figure. His legitimacy was in question due to the Treaty of Troyes, and his own mother Isabeau had signed the document disinheriting him. Rumors abounded that he was illegitimate whispers fed by Burgundian propaganda, suggesting he was not truly Charles VI's son. For much of the early 1420s, Charles VII did little to counter these doubts. He remained distant from public view, allowed his advisors to manage diplomacy and finance, and rarely appeared in military campaigns. His court was perceived as passive, even fatalistic. Many of his own supporters questioned whether he had the will to resist the Anglo-Burgundian tide. He was by all accounts an uncertain leader paralyzed by indecision and shaken by the depth of France's crisis. The legitimacy battle played out most clearly in the rituals of monarchy. In France, kingship was not merely a political status, but a sacred role conferred through anointing at Rheims Cathedral, with the holy oil said to have descended from heaven. By tradition, the coronation at Rheims affirmed not only authority, but divine favor. Yet Rheims was in English-held territory. Charles VII could not be crowned without a military breakthrough. That breakthrough came in 1429, and it would originate from a wholly unexpected source. Joan of Arc, a teenage peasant girl from Domremy in northeastern France, arrived at Charles's court in March of that year, claiming to be sent by God to deliver France from the English and to see Charles crowned at Rheims. Her message was bold, her presence unprecedented. While Charles's court remained skeptical, the desperation of the situation led them to take a chance. She was given a small force and dispatched to lift the English siege of Orleans. Against all expectations, she succeeded. Joan's presence galvanized French troops, her conviction inspired renewed morale, and her victories, especially at Orleans, broke the psychological hold that the English had maintained since Agincourt. Charles VII followed her lead. In July 1429, escorted by Joan and her forces, he entered Rheims and was crowned King of France in the traditional manner. This coronation did not end the war, nor did it immediately weaken English military strength, but it restored a vital element to Charles's kingship's symbolic legitimacy. For the first time since his father's madness had thrown the monarchy into crisis, France once again had a king who had undergone the full rite of sacral kingship. The contrast with the English claim based solely on treaty inheritance and military power was stark. In the eyes of many, the question of who was the real king of France now had a clearer answer. Meanwhile, the English regime in Paris began to show cracks. The regency under Bedford remained formidable, but local discontent simmered. Taxes imposed to support the occupation strained resources. The Burgundian alliance, while still intact, was no longer ironclad. Philip the Good, though, still opposed to Charles VII, began exploring ways to expand Burgundian autonomy, rather than continue the costly fight for English dominance. By the early 1430s, Burgundian interests were drifting away from the Anglo-centric agenda that had defined the Treaty of Troyes. Charles VII, strengthened by his coronation, and Joan's campaigns began to assert greater control. His court, once seen as weak and divided, began attracting formerly neutral or even hostile nobles. Cities in central France pledged their loyalty. Trade routes once disrupted by war reopened. A new administrative class loyal to the crown and drawn from the bourgeoisie began replacing the fractious nobles who had dominated earlier decades. Still, Charles VII's consolidation of power was not immediate, nor was it inevitable. In 1431, Joan of Arc was captured by Burgundian forces and handed over to the English. She was put on trial for heresy in Rouen, and in May of that year she was burned at the stake. Her death, however, did not reverse French gains. Instead, it cemented her as a martyr and reinforced Charles' claim to divine favor. By the mid-1430s, Charles VII had turned the tide. English control in France began to erode. Burgundian neutrality gave way to rapprochement with the crown, culminating in the 1435 Treaty of Arras, which formally ended the alliance between Burgundy and England. With this realignment, the English position became untenable. Over the next 2 decades, Charles gradually regained territory city by city, province by province. Yet all of this occurred after the death of Charles VI. The transformation of France from a divided, rudderless realm to a resurgent monarchy did not involve him. He had not witnessed his son's coronation, nor had he known of Joan's arrival. The long and terrifying final years of his life were marked not by hope, but by decline, isolation, and silence. His reign ended not with a resolution, but with a question. Could France recover from a generation of madness, war, and betrayal? The answer came not from Charles VI himself, but from the forces set in motion during his absence from a king who could not rule to a son who nearly lost everything before slowly reclaiming the throne. By the time Charles VII began systematically reclaiming France in the 1430s, the memory of Charles VI had already begun to fade from political relevance, but not from institutional legacy. His reign had become a cautionary tale for an entire generation of nobles, clerics, and administrators who had lived through 4 decades of systemic breakdown. The chaos wrought by his mental collapse, exacerbated by factional conflict, civil war, and foreign invasion, left behind scars that would define the French monarchy's evolution for the remainder of the 15th century. In the immediate years following Charles II's death, the kingdom continued to exist in a state of duality. The Anglo-French crown of Henry VI still held sway over Paris and the north, but its legitimacy steadily eroded. Charles VII, having been crowned in Reims in 1429 and solidifying alliances through diplomacy and administrative reform, pursued a strategy of attrition. Instead of massive set-piece battles, his forces focused on reclaiming strategic towns and castles, undermining English authority from within. Over time, the Anglo-Burgundian structure created under the Treaty of Troyes disintegrated not by force alone, but by exhaustion and shifting loyalties. The institutional changes Charles VII enacted were in many ways a direct response to the dysfunction witnessed during his father's reign. The experience of lawlessness, overlapping jurisdictions, and arbitrary governance under rival factions led to a conscious centralization of authority. The king began to standardize tax collection, assert greater control over military recruitment, and create a standing army loyal to the crown rather than to regional lords. The rise of professional administrators, often drawn from the educated middle class, replaced the feuding aristocratic councils that had once vied for control over a mentally ill king. These reforms would not have been possible without the lived memory of Charles II's disastrous rule. The need for a monarch who could actually govern, communicate, and command loyalty was no longer a theoretical ideal. It was a matter of survival. In this regard, Charles VI's failures provided an institutional lesson that shaped the very structure of the modern French state. The royal council became more technocratic, the judiciary more independent, and the military more disciplined. The monarchy, though still based on divine right, began to adopt early features of bureaucratic governance. Public memory of Charles VI remained complex. In the north, where Anglo-Burgundian control had dominated during his final years, he was often remembered as a tragic figure, a passive sovereign manipulated by factions and abandoned by fortune. In the south, among loyalist circles, he was sometimes viewed with embarrassment or pity, a king who had lost his mind and nearly his country. Chroniclers such as Jean Froissart and Enguerrand de Monstrelet recorded his afflictions in detail, but often with a tone of respectful detachment. Even in madness, the king was still considered sacred. Interestingly, Charles VI's reign saw the flowering of artistic and intellectual life in spite of political turmoil. The royal court, especially in its earlier years, patronized manuscript illumination, vernacular poetry, and chivalric literature. The Mad King himself was the dedicatee of several important works, though it is unclear how much he engaged with them personally. In this sense, the disconnect between the symbolic function of kingship and the reality of governance became ever more pronounced. France functioned not because of the king, but often in spite of him. Charles II's burial at Saint-Denis did little to resolve his contradictory legacy. No great monument was erected in his honor, and no widespread cult of personality emerged. He left behind a kingdom physically divided, morally shaken, and politically exhausted. But paradoxically, that exhaustion laid the foundation for reform. His death marked not only the end of a reign, but the end of an era in which monarchy could afford to be personal, erratic, and isolated from administrative responsibility. The court under Charles VII grew cautious and pragmatic. Memories of regency abuse like those during Charles VI's madness made future monarchs wary of delegating power without strict controls. Over time, the experience of the early 15th century gave rise to a more robust and resilient state, less vulnerable to the health and whims of a single man. The long shadow of Charles VI's illness had created an appetite for political reliability and institutional competence that would shape the reigns of future kings, including Louis XIII and Francis III. Even in retrospect, Charles VI remains a difficult figure to define. He was not a tyrant nor a schemer. He was not a reformer nor a warrior. His legacy is not one of ambition or ideology, but of absence. His final days were not marked by confrontation or resolve, but by withdrawal and disconnection. Yet in that silence, France came to understand what it could not survive without coherent leadership, stable succession, and functional administration. These were lessons learned not through triumph, but through the slow, often painful unraveling of royal authority. Charles VI. The king who thought himself made of glass did not shatter his kingdom in a single blow. Rather, it fractured around him piece by piece as he faded from the world he had once ruled. The reign and final days of Charles VI offer a sobering insight into the vulnerability of monarchies built on personal rule. His descent into madness was not a singular tragedy, it was a structural crisis. France in the late 14th and early 15th centuries lacked the constitutional tools to manage a monarch incapable of governing. There was no defined regency system, no legal process to declare a king unfit, and no mechanism for separating the sanctity of kingship from the practical needs of the state. As a result, Charles's incapacity became a breeding ground for factionalism, civil war, and foreign exploitation. His reign demonstrated the high cost of institutional rigidity. Power became a commodity traded among princes who claimed to speak for a silent king. The assassination of political rivals, the rise of mercenary armies, and the eventual collapse of territorial control were not isolated events, they were direct consequences of a monarchy without direction. Even foreign treaties like Troyes were framed around the fiction that Charles VI continued to willfully rule. Yet in the aftermath of his death, France did not collapse. Instead, it adapted. His son, Charles VII, despite early doubts, capitalized on the chaos to rebuild legitimacy and authority. The reforms that followed the creation of a standing army, a stronger tax base, and professional bureaucracy were forged in reaction to the failures of Charles VI's era. Madness ironically laid the groundwork for modernization. Charles VI's legacy is not one of glory or conquest. It is a mirror held up to the fragility of medieval kingship and the resilience of the state. In the long arc of French history, his reign marked the painful transition from feudal monarchy to centralized governance, one lesson, one disaster at a time.